Chapter 11. Link woke from his slumber. He had been resting in Hyrule Field and fell asleep under a tree near Gerudo Valley. He yawned and looked up at the sun, quickly closing his eyes. Just past noon, he thought. His stomach growled loudly, startling him to stand and draw his new sword in a second's time. There was no monster growling behind him. Time to go and get something to eat. Link walked with a peaceful and delighted look on his face as he marched towards Lon Lon Ranch in hopes of some free milk. He had just saved the world. Zelda and himself had trapped Ganondorf in a dimensional rift within the sacred realm. He was back to his original age. Finally he felt at rest. Then, as if recalling a nightmare in the middle of the day vividly, one that you had not remembered, a vision flew into his mind, bringing him to his knees. Link was breathing fast and heavy with his eyes wide and mouth open. A look of terror and despair was shocked onto his face. He had become haunted by the image of the dark specter that came before him in the Temple of Time. Gazing into the grass, clenching it in between his fingers, he saw the tattooed face, his face, wet with blood and laughing. This can't have been real, he thought. Maybe his sword had got closed in the door of time as it was closing, his shield too. He could have been hit by shrapnel when the shield and sword were crushed. That would explain it. He had been knocked unconscious and had a strange dream. He couldn't accept it. He knew it was real. How did this happen? Why did this happen? I wonder if anyone knows about this. I can't just forget about it, he mused to himself, gaining his composure. Link was the bearer of the Triforce of Courage, and it gave him great ability to pursue onwards in spite of hardship. Link brushed his shoulders off and ran the rest of his way to Lon Lon Ranch. When he arrived outside the ranch, he could hear the animals were in a great commotion. He picked up his pace and ran at full speed into the ranch entrance. There were Ingo and Talon, running around like crazy trying to calm the birds down, and being dive-bombed by cuckoos from every angle. Link could hear the distressed moos of cows from within the barn. When the young Hylian boy entered the large corral area, he assisted Talon and Ingo in what way he could. He played on his fairy Ocarina song, Epona's song, hoping to calm them down. The peaceful melody hung in the air like a calming blanket of warm sunlight at the end of a hard day's work. The cuckoos that were in the midst of dive bombs diverted their paths and landed, looking at the farmers with an innocent motion, then resuming their regular poking around for food. Link asked the farmers, what the heck is going on here? Why are the cuckoos up in a ruckus? Talon replied, first huffing and puffing, out of breath and bruised. Well, we were out feeding the cuckoos. Ingo let out a cough and interrupted, I don't know why you have to take them all outside in the first place to feed them. Talon resumed, like I was saying, we were out feeding the cuckoos, and heard a loud bang, smell of sulfur. Awful smelling, I mean awful, like all the eggs on the farm had been left to rot, but worse. Ingo interjected, stamping his foot down and clenching his fist in anger. Talon continued his story, so, we heard a loud bang and smelt an awful smell, but it only lasted but a moment and was carried away on the breeze. Well, after the bang, the sky got real dark, just over the farm it looked like. Talon looked up at the sky with a barely noticeable fear lurking behind his stoic brow wipe, then placing his hand on his hip he continued, we saw a man up there. The fear was now clearly audible in his voice. Dressed in black, and floating there in the sky. Ingo's knees shook as he heard his brother speak of the horror they must have witnessed. Just then Link noticed something, glancing around. No horses were on the ranch. He had been too distracted by the ravings of the farmer to recognize the horses were all gone. Epona hadn't came to him when he played the song, he thought. Link looked Talon square in the eyes with a fierceness burning in his chest. This man you saw, did he look like me? Link questioned. His mind was full of questions. Talon and Ingo both took a step backwards at Link's words. Like me, but older, and with markings on his face. Well, did he? Talon was the first to speak. Now that you mention it, I didn't think of it before. He kind of did look like you, son. But he wasn't nothing like, Ingo interrupted, shouting, he looked exactly like you. Is he your brother or something? You tell him to bring back all our horses, or I'll hold you accountable as an accomplice to this crime on our fair establishment here." Talon tried to calm his brother down, patting Ingo's steadily rising shoulders, hoping to lower his clearly rising blood pressure. Talon looked at Ingo. "He can't be related to Link here. Link would have nothing to do with his kind. You can't accuse Link here like that. We don't know if that man is related to Link." Talon looked at Link again, his eyes squinting this time as if trying to scrutinize the subtle differences in cuckoo eggs. "You know, he really did look a lot like you, but he couldn't be you, my son." Link was fed up with this. "I'm tired of this. I'm not related to him. I want to find him. I have a bad feeling about him." Link stopped for a moment, assessing the situation, realizing their utter confusion as to why he looked just like the man in black. "Listen, I think I saw him in a dream, and now you are saying you saw him here. What happened? What did he do? I want to find this guy and take him down." Talon looked at Ingo, and looked at Link, then back at Ingo. He let out a deep sigh and faced the boy again. "Okay son, this man who looked a lot like you appeared in the sky, and then he slowly floated down like a feather, but straight down." Talon moved his hand to illustrate the slow descent of the dark figure. There he was, standing in the middle of the corral, facing the silo. He sat down and pulled out an ocarina. Ingo jumped in to add. "The horses were running around like crazy, mind you, and the cuckoos were attacking us." Ingo then rubbed some of his cuckoo wounds, remembering his pain. Talon continued recalling events. "The song was unlike any I've heard you play on our farm. It was a powerful melody. The dark clouds opened up a hole in them, a beam of purple light funneled down over the man, and he stood up. This is when we got a good look at his face. He started spinning around like mad, pointing his palms at the horses." Talon gulped a knot in his throat and went on. "Each horse he pointed his hands at, flew up weightless just like a feather, and was all sucked into that hole in the sky." Ingo flailed about and shouted, "And if you have anything to do with him, you better get our horses back. How are we supposed to make any money around here? We've been robbed." Link stood motionless, processing what he had heard. This man had an ocarina, and he was able to play a song that Link did not know, perhaps a very powerful and dangerous song with the power to enable the performer some sort of magical power. What color was his ocarina? Link asked as if he needed to know this answer more than anything. Ingo and Talon both said in unison. Blue. Ingo stammered, "I hardly see how this is of any relevance. We need our horses back, and as of now you are the biggest culprit. You play one of those instruments too." In order to calm Ingo down, Link said hurriedly, "I will find your horses and return them to you. I just need to get as much information as possible to find this guy." Ingo held his shoulders up and crossed his arms, pointing his chin up and looking down at Link. He sneered, "You best know you will be getting our horses back, you little thief. Don't think I don't know you played a part in this." Ingo then turned around and walked away towards the grain silo, obviously teeming with rage. Talon looked at Link and sighed, then said, "Well, thank you son, we are glad to have your help in this predicament. We won't be able to pay taxes on the ranch if we don't have our prize-winning horses to rent out." "I'll get your horses back, you can count on me," Link reassured Talon. "Now I need something to eat though. Think you could cook me up some eggs and I could get a glass of milk?" Talon laughed jovially as if nothing dark or mysterious just happened. He looked at Link and smiled. "Of course my boy, you need the energy for your horse hunt." He continued to laugh and walked Link into the farmhouse to make a meal for him. Chapter 12. Link woke up in his chamber in the middle of the night, startled only enough to produce a small tremor through his body, but not enough to make him sit upright. He was haunted by an image of himself, pure-looking and unmarked, a possibility of who he could have been had he not been taken by the king of the Gerudo. He had been having many visions of this face in his dreams as of late. He was simply attributing it to his lost childhood, lingering feelings of remorse for his youthful self, an innocence lost. But he knew when his dreams were recurring like this it was premonition. Link had trained his mind with long hours of meditation in the hot Gerudo desert. Sometimes he would go 4 days at a time in meditation without food or water. He couldn't simply ignore the plain signs of premonition. Gatoru had taught him this early on. He would recall his dreams to Gatoru each morning as instructed, and often it seemed he would have these premonition dreams as she called them. He learned to pay attention to his dreams and be aware within them so he could retain as much information as possible. This was considered one of Link's valuable qualities to Ganondorf and he wished for it to be honed. Link then closed his eyes and sent his mind back into a restful sleep. A few hours later it was morning. Link woke and sat cross-legged in the middle of his room. This was his morning ritual every day. He breathed deeply and exercised his magical systems, opening his body and mind, cleaning away any distraction. The face popped into his mind again like a parasite not willing to be purged. He focused his energy to where it had appeared in his psyche and it disappeared. He looked like a statue, the sunlight peering in over his form, highlighting his profile. He had black tattoos on his face, each of his eyes had 4 spikes, emanating from them. 2 pointed upwards and 2 pointed down on each eye. The spikes towards the outside of his face were slightly longer than the ones closer to his nose. The tattoos served as a reminder to him. They were a symbol used to exemplify Link's undying cause to serve his Dark Lord. He had grown to accept them and accept his role as a servant of Ganondorf. He was the most powerful among all of the Gerudo in the fortress. For most of his youth Gatoru held that place. But a few years ago Link began surpassing even her abilities in both combat and magic. Link let a deep breath complete itself slowly before coming to his feet. About 1 hour had passed, the normal amount of time he spent clearing his mind before training began for the day. He grabbed his sabers and secured them both to his hips, then put on his hat and exited his room with a phantom-like precision. He was on top of the fortress in no time and he looked out over the complex, sand blowing in from the desert. He saw Gatoru coming in through the gate in the distance. Link performed a graceful pirouette into a somersault as he leapt from the highest point of the fortress to the lowest, about a 4-story drop. He rose gingerly from a crouch landing and jogged over to meet Gatoru. The sun rides high. Gatoru, shouldn't we have begun our training an hour ago? It was Link's poor excuse for a joke. He didn't seem to understand humor. Ha ha, Gatoru faked laughter in an obvious manner as to show she understood that Link was attempting to be funny, but did not succeed in doing so. This was one of the few playful activities they still shared. Now most of their time was spent as opponents to each other to train their abilities past their maximum. Gatoru said to Link in her usual monotone voice, Ganondorf has requested your audience at the Desert Colossus. With no hesitation, Link raised his right hand into the sky, placing his left hand at his lips with his first 2 fingers pointed upwards and the rest formed into a fist. He said some incantations under his breath, raised his left knee to his chest and clapped his hands together. A loud crack was heard like thunder, and he had disappeared from the space he was standing in. 1 second later Link had rematerialized in the sky above the Desert Colossus. His molecules were still forming together, giving his body more and more mass each passing second, causing him to slowly descend towards the ground. When he had landed, he looked around to see where Ganondorf might be, if he was outside at all. This was highly unlikely. He most often was inside the Spirit Temple, in the highest chamber sitting in his throne there. Link saw no note of Ganondorf outside and made his way into the Spirit Temple. Link ascended the levels of the Spirit Temple, completing all of the trials again. Every time he came to see Ganondorf here he had to complete the trials. This was a preventative measure against those who wished to see harm done to the King of Thieves. Link removed the boss key from his belt and inserted it into the great lock securing the throne room. Chapter 13. As Link opened the door to the deepest chamber of the temple, he could smell the thick aroma of incense burning, and a cloud of smoke poured out over him. Ganondorf oftentimes would have 100 or more large incense sticks burning at a time in a room totally closed off from outside air. Link preferred the air to be at least somewhat breathable. He pressed his cuff against his nose and mouth and coughed, then walked slowly into the throne room. Ganondorf's throne was empty, but 2 honor guards still stood at attention on either side, clad in their golden armor. All around the room there were Gerudo dressed in nothing but a few scars, laying on mats and pillows sprawled out on the polished wooden floor. There, among the Gerudo women, lay Ganondorf. He was sprawled out on an exceptionally large, golden, daybed. It was adorned with snake-like features, and most noticeably, a gem-encrusted golden cobra head with its cape raised out wide serving as the head of the daybed. Link hadn't removed his cuff from his nose, and he was already feeling lightheaded from the thick smoke. He regained his composure and stood at attention a good 30 feet away from the king of the Gerudo. "Gatoru sent me here, she says you wish to speak with me," Link said in a deep monotone voice. The one Gerudo male born in 100 years raised his head slightly to see Link standing in the entryway. He motioned for the Gerudo women hanging around to leave with a quick motion of his hand. All the Gerudo women stood up, some dizzy from the smoke, and exited out of the chamber into a smaller room that was separated by a thick red curtain with gold accents. Gendorf sat up, his long, shoulder-length, red hair, swayed gallantly behind him. He placed his hands on his knees, then raised himself to his full height. The man was an astonishing height, at just under 7 feet tall. He was a giant. His massive frame, clad in thick leather armor, dominated the room. "Link, I've called you here because today you are going to have your first mission." Hearing the words made Link's jaw drop a fraction of an inch. He had never had a mission before. He trained endlessly day in and day out for over 7 years, just to hear these words. He showed no emotion other than the slight movement in his jaw which he had quickly returned. "Yes, master, what is my mission?" Link stated rather than questioned, in his slow and monotone voice. Gendorf smirked and then let his lips peel back into a cruel smile. "I see you are quite excited. After all, you have been waiting for over 7 years for this day, haven't you?" Gendorf paused, his smile returning to an emotionless still, hard horizontal line. "Have you learned nothing? You cannot show any emotion. You will face consequences for this, but right now I need you to go and find an object for me." Gendorf ran his fingers through his long red hair, securing it at least temporarily behind his ears. The giant placed his hands on his hips and then quickly removed one, to motion towards Link as he spoke to him. "I need you to find me." Gendorf then pointed towards himself deliberately, the Ocarina of Time. Gendorf then put his hand on his hip again, rejoining its brother. He laughed. Gendorf smiled at Link. "If you don't find me the Ocarina of Time, I will kill you," he said in a very matter-of-fact tone, ending with a cold, emotionless smirk. Showing no trace of emotion, Link bowed his head and uttered the words "Yes, master." Then simply raised his right hand and brought his left hand to his lips, pressing the pointer and middle fingers to his lips while holding the other 2 fingers with his thumb. He made a few movements with his lips and inaudible words escaped his mouth. He then in one fluid motion raised his left knee to his chest and clapped his hands together over his head. He disappeared with a loud thunder crack and visible blast wave that first blew the numerous tapestries in the room away and then, in the same second, back towards the point where Link had been standing. Gendorf sneezed, and then called out for the Gerudo women to rejoin him. He lay back on his daybed and let out a few laughs. "What a day," Gendorf says, running his large fingers through his thick mane once again. Chapter 14. Link materialized above the lone tree in the middle of the Great Lake Hylia. He slowly descended, ending in a soft landing on the uppermost branches of the tree. There he casually shifted his weight onto his right leg, and then placed his right hand on his hip. Link let out a deep yawn and held his left hand over his mouth. Sleepily, Link fell backwards out of the tree, right out into the lake. He entered the water like a bullet, making only the smallest ripple on the surface of the water. This particular dive was made for reconnaissance missions where subtlety and stealth were of the utmost importance. This mission didn't particularly call for stealth. If anyone did see him, he could easily wipe the image from their minds with dark sorcery. But, Link wanted to test his abilities on his first mission. As his body entered the water, he sent himself diving even deeper than he would normally, by altering the polarity of his atoms and, pulling himself, towards the core of the planet. He made it to the bottom of the lake in a matter of seconds. He then gracefully flipped himself over and placed his feet on the lake bed. He didn't kick up any mud or debris, because he was perfectly buoyant to stay just a few inches from the silt. Link propelled himself forward using a connection he had with the magnetic poles of the planet. Link had honed this skill in his endless wanderings of the Gerudo Desert. He had the necessity to use magnetic forces to traverse through the near-constant sandstorm of a desert, when he had been temporarily blinded, by Ganondorf, as a punishment for failing a series of magical tests. He had only missed one syllable for one incantation, in a series of 144 spells, that Link was required to perform in audience with Ganondorf. But Ganondorf was very ruthless in his training procedures. Perhaps Ganondorf would have blinded him either way, perhaps that is what it took to finally learn and master magnetic forces. Without them he would have been a dried husk right now, mummified by the harsh conditions in the scorching desert. Link was drawn to a spot beneath the waterfall of the Gerudo Valley River. He had already located the ocarina using his understanding of nature and his own psyche, coupled with a locating spell. First he was drawn deep into his mind back to when he had seen Princess Zelda throw the Ocarina of Time into the river behind him. He had kept this a secret from Ganondorf, always holding on to it as his last shred of humanity. Many times Ganondorf had interrogated Link about the Ocarina. These interrogations always ended in a puddle of blood, and no answers for the King of Thieves. Now Link was through with his humanity, he was done. He had found the ocarina using his natural understanding of the physics of a flute and the physics of water amongst other things, which he learned under the watchful eye of the Gerudo King. Gatoru was his daily training partner, but Ganondorf was the one who would teach either of them a new ability, which they would have to practice on their own after seeing it one time. Ganondorf did not like to repeat himself. He knew the ocarina would have circled the lake over the years, and eventually be pulled under the waterfall, and then buried under the heavy silt and debris that had built up there. Link was nearly 99% sure that the ocarina was exactly where he envisioned it. He reached out with his mind and held onto it, grabbing its form. He pulled the ocarina upwards and out of the pile of branches and silt. The ocarina's hollow was filled with mud, its outside was coated in a form of underwater moss. Floating there in front of him, it looked ancient and powerful. He figured he may as well clean the ocarina now. Rotating it just slightly with his mind, he then gazed into the mouth hole pointed right at him. Link gingerly reached his hands out, slowly they found their way around the ocarina. He covered each hole with his fingers, making sure they were sealed. His grip was firm, he gazed deeply into the mouth hole. Using a great amount of focus and energy, Link managed to send a beam of heat through the water. This ability used the eyes as a focus for a beam of energy, built up in the center of his whole body. The heat was so intense that it caused his eyes to glow red, before, during, and for a few moments after the pulse of energy was released. This was definitely not necessary for his mission, but what was wrong with a little fun, he thought. The mud inside the ocarina had been nearly completely vaporized, what was left he simply shook out in the water. The green moss that had once been coating part of the surface of the ocarina was disintegrated in the tense vibrations. The instrument sparkled once again, it brought back memories of Zelda. Link swatted away these memories like an unwanted insect. Couldn't he just be free of this fabled past, that he had grown so distant from? He grabbed the ocarina and placed it in a leather pouch on his waist. He secured the leather strap keeping the pouch closed, and then he again performed the teleportation incantation with deep vibration in his voice, intense enough to cause sound underwater. With a loud crack and a visible splash on the surface of the water, Link was gone. He had dematerialized once again. In the next moment Link appeared at the Desert Colossus. When he landed, he started off towards the entrance of the temple, like he was on an unshakable path. Link finished the trials with ease and placed the boss key into the lock. Link was affronted once again by a cloud of incense, this time, a different scent than the last time he made audience with the King of Thieves. It smelled floral and fruity. Ganondorf was not expecting Link at any exact time, and Link hadn't mentioned to him or Gatoru that he was arriving. The soul male Gerudo was again laying on his golden daybed. This time however he was not clad in his usual leather armor. He was fully nude save for a loincloth covering him. Ganondorf's rippling muscles could be seen in their fullness, pulsing and contracting, visibly changing size as he moved. "I wasn't expecting you." Ganondorf looked over at Link and in the same moment shooed away the Gerudo women. The dozen or so women on and around his daybed fled into the smaller chamber, not wanting to have to be told twice. They moved as quickly as possible. Ganondorf stood up and grabbed a dark black and brown robe, which he casually hung over his muscular form. He left the front of the robe open and made 3 or 4 strides towards Link, crossing the 30-foot distance almost instantaneously. "You have the Ocarina of Time." Ganondorf let loose with a smile. "Give it to me," Ganondorf demanded. He held out his large hand at waist height awaiting the ocarina to be placed in his gargantuan palm. Link slowly removed from his bag the Ocarina of Time. He held it in his hands, not fully aware of its true power, but knowing that what he was about to turn over to Ganondorf was indeed an incredibly powerful instrument, with unknown potential. He dropped it into Ganondorf's hand. The giant of a man turned around, facing his back to Link now. He marveled at the instrument and laughed. "Ha ha ha ha." Ganondorf held the ocarina with one hand gazing into its deep blue color, and with his other hand he ran his fingers through his hair, moving strands out of his field of vision, and letting them cascade once again into the position they had just been in around his face. He then smiled and laughed again. "Ha ha ha ha." Ganondorf once again ran his fingers through his hair, this time taking care to place either side of his red mane behind each ear. He now licked his top lip and laughed again. "Ha ha 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 ha. I have it, I have the Ocarina of Time, now my plan can finally take place," Ganondorf exclaimed, with a notable scent of insanity emanating from his person. Ganondorf turned around and looked at Link, his robe falling open and exposing his whole upper thigh of his left leg, the leg he had turned around with to face Link. Ganondorf placed all of his weight on his right leg, and placed his right arm on his hip. In Ganondorf's left hand was the ocarina, which he held in 2 fingers delicately pointed at Link. "I want you to take this ocarina and perform a small task for me." Ganondorf sighed and then rolled his eyes. "As you can see," Ganondorf elaborated, "I am just a little too big to play this instrument." Ganondorf rolled his eyes, and then he gazed at Link with a hint of disgust. "I need you to play this ocarina, and use it to enter the sacred realm, very soon." The King of Thieves then thrust the ocarina towards Link and faced his head the other way, tapping his left foot quickly. He awaited Link to take it from his hand. Link reached out and grabbed the ocarina from the intoxicated man. Link could always tell when Ganondorf was drinking wine, he would act much more feminine. Link understood this. Ganondorf was born with only females to look to for guidance. Sure, he slaughtered many of his own kin and other tribes, but he still had a rather delicate side. Ganondorf only let his honor guards and the select few Gerudo who he let take care of his needs ever see him this way. Link happened to be the closest thing Ganondorf had to a son, so when he was intoxicated he didn't mind Link seeing him that way. Ganondorf took both of his hands and held his hair back. It was almost as if he thought the longer he pressed his hands onto his hair the longer it would stay in that position when he released. The hair came rushing back to the front and sides of his face like a curtain trying to block out his golden eyes. Ganondorf strutted over towards his throne. Upon arriving, he let out another deep sigh. He reached onto the arm of the golden throne and procured a large, gold, wire tiara. The tiara had jewels fashioned to it, making for a dazzling display. Ganondorf ran his fingers through his hair, combing it backwards over the top of his head, and down the back of his neck. Then before his hair could have a chance to come free, and attempt to hide his face, the giant man secured the tiara in place on the crown of his head. Satisfied, the King of Thieves turned around and then sat down in his throne. He both crossed his right leg over his left, and leaned to the right onto his right fist, which was held upwards solely for the purpose of supporting his large head. "In 3 days' time, you will enter the sacred realm," Ganondorf told Link, not asking him, but expecting it out of him. "You will need to learn these songs." Ganondorf then pulled a thick book, at least as large in volume as the man's forearm, from behind his throne. He cast the book towards Link. It landed perfectly at his dark apprentice's feet. Link looked down at the tome, and read the ancient Hylian on the cover of the book, songs of power, wisdom, and courage. He picked it up. It was heavy and bulky. Then Link said in his monotone voice, "I shall take this and study these songs, then I will return." Ganondorf sighed again, coupled with an eye roll. He looked at Link again and demanded, 3 days. He shouted. "You have 3 days to learn these songs, then, I will instruct you on the rest of this mission." Ganondorf called his women into the room with a quick snap of his fingers. As the Gerudo women were hurriedly returning, he shooed Link away without a second glance, and his gaze met the women entering his chamber. Link teleported away, and rematerialized in his bedchamber. It was night time, so he lit a few candles, and placed his book on the small desk in his room. He sat down with the book and opened it, Ocarina by his side to practice the songs on. A flicker of light could be seen in the window to his chamber. Many Ocarina melodies were heard that night, some accompanied by great bright and colored lights, flashing out his window.